Welcome to PPLS Perspectives, a podcast bringing students and academics together to explore the research carried out by the University of Edinburgh's School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences and the impact this work has on society.
Welcome to PPLS Perspectives, where we discuss current research happening in the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. Each episode we will hear from a member of faculty in the department about their ongoing work, and that will be hosted by graduate students studying in PPLS. My name is Maisy Hallam. I'm a PhD student in the CLE and I study the evolution of kinship terminology. And today I'll be chatting with Kenny Smith, who is Professor of Evolutionary Linguistics, Chair of the Centre for Language Evolution, and perhaps most importantly, my supervisor.
Yeah.
So today, if you couldn't guess from our affiliation, we'll be discussing language evolution, how language is shaped by pressures associated with learning and communicating, and what methods we can use for studying the history of something that leaves no fossils, as language does. If you've listened to the podcast before, you'll know the drill. We've got 5 questions, so we'll all learn about Kenny's research, but we start with the elevator pitch. So, in one elevator trip's worth of time, about 2 minutes, we will ask Kenny, tell us about your research. What is it all about?
So you kind of said it already, more succinctly than I'm going to, but I'm interested in language evolution. So I am interested in how languages evolve as a result of being passed from generation to generation and used for communication. So the kind of big picture idea is that languages persist through a cycle of learning and use. So you're immersed in a linguistic community, you learn the language or languages used in that community through exposure, and you use language to express yourself, share your thoughts and feelings with other people. And as a kind of inadvertent side effect of using language to communicate, you're generating more linguistic data, which forms the basis for learning in other people in your community. So the idea is that language is shaped by biases and pressures that are inherent in that cycle of learning and use. So languages are under pressure to be learnable by language learners and to allow us to express our thoughts and feelings in a kind of relatively efficient, reasonably precise fashion. So there are lots of areas of linguistics that study different aspects of how languages are shaped by these pressures of learning and use. So that historical linguistics, sociolinguistics, and pragmatics is about how language is used for communication. There's kind of 2 distinctive things about what we do in the Centre for Language Evolution. One is that we apply that perspective to language origins. So can we explain the origins of the kind of fundamental structural properties shared by all languages as a result of explaining those as a consequence of biases in learning and use? And then the other thing we do that's a bit distinctive is that we try and demonstrate how these processes work and show the kind of link between processes of learning and communication and then particular design features of language. So we do that using computer simulations of that kind of historical transmission process, and we also these days also run experiments with human participants where we simulate the process of language transmission, communication experimentally and test theories about how learning and use shape linguistic systems.
That's great. I feel like we've been in this elevator for a long time, but I enjoyed
it's
it.
a DSB elevator and we're stuck on level 2.
So could you give us like an example, maybe what's a project you've worked on lately or a hypothesis you've tested in this remit?
Okay, so probably the most recent experiment I've done that kind of uses all those methods together is some work with Clem Ashton and Helen Sims-Williams, who were employed on a grant I had. So we were interested in the relationship between frequency and irregularity in linguistic systems. So the kind of nutshell is that languages in general are very regular and rule governed. You have rules which explain how to build complex utterances and allow you to interpret those complex expressions in a kind of rule governed compositional way. And that's where the communicative power of language comes from. So you follow the rules, you can generate expressions like the one I'm producing now that nobody's ever heard exactly before, but because you know the rules of combination, you can work out the meaning. There are bits of language that don't follow the rules, that are irregular, and those tend to occur, they're kind of idiosyncratic, and those tend to occur in regions for concepts which we need to express frequently. So there's this relationship that frequent things tend to be irregular, infrequent things have to follow the rules and be regular and compositional. So we were interested in demonstrating how that frequency irregularity correlation could emerge through this process of learning and use. So we ran a series of experiments where we had participants try and learn a miniature language that had some irregularities and some regularities in it. Then they used it to communicate with another person, playing a little communication game using the miniature language. And then we take the language they produce during communication and we use that as the basis for learning in a fresh generation of participants. So we're simulating those two kind of key processes: language transmission from generation to generation via learning, and the thing that's transmitted are the products of communicative use. And we were interested in, like, we set it up so there were some things you had to talk about frequently, some things you had to talk about infrequently, and we were looking to see, and actually what we found was that irregularity emerged and persisted among the frequent concepts, and the less frequent concepts had to be expressed in a regular compositional fashion.
Cool. And I guess while we're talking about methodology, we've kind of covered already how you do it, these kind of experimental methods. Earlier you briefly mentioned simulation methods as well. So maybe an interesting way to continue talking about this would be, what kind of pushback do you face about these methods? So you're teaching people miniature languages. I wonder, have you experienced much pushback from people who are like, what can you really tell about real language out in the wild from these kind of heavily controlled experiments where you're working with something kind of artificial?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually we get pushback on both methods. So we started off with only running computational simulations of these processes, and I think actually that's the way to demonstrate how these particular pressures in a nice controlled computational model, how particular pressures from learning and use result in particular linguistic outcomes. Beautiful, it's the way to do it. People hate that. People didn't like that as much, because they're like, well, you've just built it into the model. There's obviously a relationship between this pressure and this outcome.
Yeah, people don't understand computers.
Yeah, people also don't like, even computer science audiences, when you talk to them about a computer model, they glaze over. It's a bit discouraging. So that was one of the things that motivated us to switch to doing these experiments where you're actually showing, look, this also happens if you swap out our computer learner communicator and swap in a real human with all the biases and so on that humans have. And so we can show the same processes in these controlled experiments where we're actually using real humans as our simulated language learners communicators. But you're right that we do get some resistance to that, and that these are miniature languages. We have to set up the experiments so the little miniature languages can be learned in a few tens of minutes, an hour, or often in a single session, sometimes over a few sessions, but that makes it more expensive. So people are like, well, to what extent are the processes of learning in particular on these tiny miniature languages, to what extent do they actually mirror processes of real natural language learning, where you're learning much larger, much more complex linguistic systems over a far longer time span. Weirdly, people worry less about the communicative stuff. So most of the criticism we get of the method is to do with the learning component. Our response to those kinds of criticisms, and thankfully we do have one, is that it turns out that there are actually parallels in how people learn these miniature languages and how they learn real natural languages. So, for instance, a classic one is that as you early in learning, natural language learners will tend to produce a simpler, regularized version of the system, and then later in learning, they kind of approach the complexity of the full system. We see the same thing over the time course of a single session within one of our miniature language learning experiments. You can look at priming effects, so people's tendency to repeat constructions they've recently heard. You see those same kind of priming effects in miniature language learning. There's been some studies that have looked at brain neural responses to natural versus artificial languages, and you see some parallels there in the areas of the brain and also the kind of time course of brain responses to these artificial linguistic stimuli. So it's an ongoing area of research, but there are reasonable grounds for thinking that we're tapping into the relevant processes. On an abstract level, the key thing for us is that we can, in these controlled experiments, we have a particular pressure we're interested in, so say a pressure for simplification during learning. As long as that shows up in our experiment, and we think there's reasonable grounds for thinking the same pressure shows up in natural languages, then that's good enough for us. Whether it's exactly the same brain areas on the same time courses, involving the same kind of representations, doesn't actually matter for the kinds of things we want to demonstrate. So as long as we're simulating the key features of natural language learning in our experiments, and that's good enough for our purpose. Because what we're interested in is not actually the language learning process, it's the consequences of particular biases in language learning and how those reshape linguistic systems.
Yeah, and I think that when you do this kind of work, you get very accustomed to the idea that you have to make sacrifices for complexity in order to study something quite specific. And people that work more with language more generally, with like cross-linguistic stuff, like they're looking at actual languages, they are not so used to having to sacrifice that complexity, and it can be hard to accept that that's actually a good course of action.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
suppose.
There's a benefit, which is control and an ability to study processes in the real world unfold very, very slowly. The cost is that you have to you're losing a little bit of ecological validity, so you have to pay that cost of a bit of skepticism about whether the two processes are actually the same in the relevant ways.
Yeah. Okay. That kind of covers my next question as well, which was going to be about kind of challenges associated with conducting this research. And I guess if I could take a guess at what your response to that would be, it would be setting those parameters, working out what it is that you're going to simplify, what particular pressure or bias are you going to look at. That's actually a very long process. You know, we make it sound very easy by going like, oh, you know, well, we're interested in how learning affects language change, and so we're just going to simplify to learning, but what does that really mean, kind of thing? Are there any other kind of challenges or difficulties? What's your least favorite part of the research process?
Basically, it's that. So people are like, when I give my like opening lecture in my course, Origins and Evolution of Language, like humans are these like amazing, like linguistically kind of competent individuals who can like effortlessly acquire and use languages in this really sophisticated fashion. And then you run an experiment where you're trying to get people to learn a really simple miniature language, and they're generally quite bad at it and quite variable, particularly things like word learning. I mean, I'm terrible at learning words in new languages, and our experiment participants are the same. So that means that you have to, there can be quite a long tuning process of figuring out, given the funds we've got available, given the time slot, given the overall length of this experiment, like what is the kind of simplest version of the feature, the thing we're interested in, that we could actually set up so people have a chance of learning and figuring out how to use this linguistic system. So the thing I was talking about, the project I was talking about before on regularity and frequency, or irregularity and frequency, we actually went through like 7 versions of that experiment trying to find something that could embody the phenomena we were interested in, but which was feasible to run online. So we did this during the pandemic, so we were recruiting participants, crowdsourced participants online. The relatively inattentive, relatively strong time pressures for designing those experiments. So Clem and me and Helen went through like 7 iterations of that experiment trying to find a version that worked. Then we finally found a version that worked, we ran it, the results looked beautiful, and then of course you're like, oh, is there these results real, or is this just because we kept running bad experiments until one of them showed what we wanted, so then we had to replicate the whole thing again. So that's my least favourite thing, is being disappointed that people can't learn the thing I want them to learn in the time I've got available for them to learn it.
Yeah, I think that's actually my least favourite thing as well. And weirdly, when you start the PhD, it's the thing you're most excited for, is like, oh, experiment design, I'm going to be so competent at it. And then like, yeah, it's the worst bit of the process. You can never predict what people are going to do. Well, you can have a hypothesis, but you have no idea how people are actually going to respond in the lab.
And there's that, like, at one point I thought, oh, I've got quite good intuitions about what people are going to be able to do. And then recently I've decided that I actually have really terrible intuitions about, well, I mean, you've experienced this, yeah, design some of your experiments. I'm like, yeah, that'll be fine, make it more complicated.
That's not on you, that's on all of us. Yeah. Okay, so I guess final question, wrapping up really. The question on paper is kind of, what's the impact of this work, or like what effect does it have on the world? And I loathe to ask you that, because I hate it when people ask me, because we're not studying like cancer research, we're not like doing rocket science. Like, for a lot of people there's not a tangible benefit of what we do.
What's the tangible benefit of rockets?
I don't know, space exploration is maybe very interesting to a lot of people. So is language, in my opinion. So instead, I'm going to ask it, why do you do it? Like, who do you hope will find your work interesting, or what led you to go, yeah, I'm going to do a PhD, I'm going to do a whole career in language evolution?
I find it super interesting.
Yeah.
I find it super interesting. Like I can't actually remember why I picked linguistics as an undergraduate degree, but I did linguistics and AI, and then I was kind of hunting around for like what's my thing going to be. I thought I might end up doing like natural language processing, which in the mid-90s when I was an undergraduate was really boring and not very good. And then I did this course by Jim Herford and Simon Kirby. So they were. I guess Jim was a professor. Simon was a young postdoc in those days.
Imagine that.
Jim's retired now. Simon's still here, and that course was just amazing. It was using computer models to simulate learning and also simulate biological evolution. I'd come across some of those techniques, but I'd never seen them kind of applied to language in the same way. And so that course was super inspiring and really exciting. And so that's just continued throughout my whole career. Like I find language interesting. I find the way that we're humans are creating it and rebuilding it and recreating it, and every generation and basically redesigning the language to meet their needs. I find that super exciting. And like coming to the impact question, part of it is that the reason I think it's not just pure self-indulgence to study this thing because I like it is like other people are fascinated by it. So like we do some workshops with primary school kids, so like 10-year-olds. I've done something similar at Saughton prison with guys who are locked up there for a long time. Totally different audiences. In both cases, they flipping love hearing about language evolution. They're totally fascinated by linguistic diversity, by the historical relatedness between languages. It's a product of this process of language transmission. They're fascinated by things, relatively technical things like Zipf's law of abbreviation. So the fact that frequent words tend to be short. It's another frequency linguistic form correlation. And so I talk about that stuff to those guys, and they have the same reaction. This is amazing that all languages work in this way, and it's obvious why languages are designed like that. So that's why I'm interested in it. I think there are actually potential kind of spin-off technical applications of this kind of research. So for instance, one of my students, Henry Conklin, is working on looking at the internal representations of deep neural networks, thinking about those as evolving linguistic systems, and then applying ideas from language evolution to look at the pressures that are shaping those evolved internal representations, if we think of them as languages that the network is basically using to communicate with itself. So there are actually applications of these kinds of ideas. It's studying how communication systems respond to the pressures that shape them actually does have applications, and maybe one day people who build rockets will use some of those ideas as the pinnacle of scientific achievement if it's in a rocket. Yeah, but basically I just study it because I think it's super interesting, and it's not just me who thinks that. Like people are fascinated by language, fascinated by linguistic diversity when they hear about it, fascinated by this idea that language works the way it does because we unintentionally make it work that way and make it work for us.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. I was slightly dismissive of its like worldwide value, in the sense that, yeah, I've done these workshops with kids as well, and they are fascinated, and it's so cute to see them get excited about something that is just like, language is so normal to everybody, but they never think about how it works. But yeah, I'm the same. I always tell people the reason that I study what I do is because I thought one day, imagine I'm at a dinner party, what would I want to tell the person next to me that I do? And so far in my experience, people love to hear about language evolution at the dinner table. So
Zipf's law of abbreviation, that's the perfect dinner party conversation. Everyone loves Zipf's law of abbreviation.
Yeah, or at least they're nodding and smiling, but there might be nothing behind the eyes.
That's a common experience for me at dinner parties.
Okay, thank you, Kenny, for joining me on PPLS Perspectives, and thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this chat about language evolution. I hope you found it more interesting than, for instance, rocket science. And we will see you next time on the podcast for more current research happening in the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences.